You're on mute.
All right, let's try this now. Well, hey, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the mute issue. Thank you for joining us today for the Rebel Recharge Lecture. Very excited to have you all. I'm David Navarro, a proud double alumni here at UNLV 2012-2013 with the Lee Business School. I went to accounting, got both my degrees in accounting, so don't hold that against me. But it is my honor to personally welcome you all here today. I happen to be the UNLV Alumni Association Vice President, incoming president. So we're happy to have you here. And personally, I'm grateful that you all are making the time and thankful for our presenters, and want to give a special shout out and welcome to Renee, who you all heard from earlier, who's our coordinator for programs and events for producing today's virtual lecture. So thank you, Renee. And we have a great lineup of engaging events coming up this fall, which includes today. And for the ones coming up, we hope to see you there as well. The full schedule, you can find that at engage.unlv.edu/events. We may throw that in the chat if you want to take a look at that for upcoming events we have. Our goal is to continue to grow our programs and events, create fun, educational, engaging opportunities for alumni, faculty, staff, students, and community members. Our next virtual Rebel Recharge will take place on Friday, September 9th. So I hope you can make it. It's entitled Back from the Brink, Productively Navigating Group Conflicts. That's going to be presented by David Schwartz, a professor, gaming historian, and ombuds at UNLV. Hopefully I said that word right. Today's discussion, though, is entitled The Changing Workforce Post-Pandemic in Southern Nevada and Its Impact on Economic Diversification Efforts, presented by our very own Andrew Woods, Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research here at UNLV. I think it's affectionately known as CBER. I may be wrong. Andrew brings more than 15 years of experience as a business and public affairs professional. He has degrees from American University and the University of Chicago. But Andrew, it's never too late. You can always get another degree here at UNLV. But prior to joining UNLV's CBER, Andrew started and ran a successful economic analysis, financial management, and public affairs consulting firm as CEO of Wood Strategies in Las Vegas. Andrew, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us. Now, everyone, please join me in welcoming Andrew Woods to the spotlight.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for making time on your lunch hour to be here. We've got a packed schedule or information for you here, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to run obviously a PowerPoint, and we're going to cover a couple different topics. We're going to talk about our population growth. Some of you may have seen, but CBER released our population forecast for 2022 through the next 40 years. We've been doing this for 26 years. I'll talk a little about that. I'm going to talk about the workforce. I'm going to talk about the business and business confidence. And I'm also going to talk about, because I know I'm going to get questions on this about inflation and recession. So I'm going to get started and share my screen. Make sure I've got the right one up. Here we go. So can everyone see that? Renee, does that look? Give me a thumbs up. All right, thumbs up. All right. So thank you again. So again, the changing dynamic workforce here in Southern Nevada and what's been happening over the last 2 years, and then looking also at the next 40 years. Just very quickly, there we go. So very quickly about the Center for Business and Economic Research. We have been at UNLV for the last 46 years, since 1975, so actually 47 years going on now. And we are essentially a center within the business school that goes out and takes academia, connects academia with private sector or public sector partners, nonprofits, and we apply real world economic analysis to problems. And we've done all sorts of work. I mean, one of my favorite that I like to talk about is we did an economic impact of Grateful Dead concerts in the 1990s on the Las Vegas economy. But we also do that's a fun one. But we do serious things too. We do the population forecast. We've done economic impact of building a medical school or a black fire for the university. We've done stuff for the state, looking at tax issues and incentives. We're doing a lot of work right now in the lithium ion industry. We're also doing things on transportation around building complete streets and incentivizing counties and cities to build more streets, complete streets to help with pedestrian safety and mobility for bicyclists, and even in other transportation type projects. So we kind of have our hand in all sorts of different topics, but what we do for the public on a daily, if not weekly basis, is also look at our macro trends in the economy and where we're going, where we're headed, to be a resource for all of you of what kind of change is happening in our community, because there's a lot of change happening in our community, and how might we better manage some of that change and think about the community that we want to grow into. So let me just start off talking about, this is where we were in April of 2020, a very scary time. We had a third of our workforce unemployed, and you can see this is basically a comparison between the reduction by job type or industry sector in Southern Nevada versus the US. So the red bar is Southern Nevada reduction, and then the US reductions, and pretty scary time. I think we all are familiar with this. Some of us were working from home, some of us were necessary workers and had to continue to go into work. But you can see that our economy here in Southern Nevada fell off a cliff with the pandemic. And for us at CBER, that's a very scary moment to be watching that and hoping that we recover. Well, this is where we are as of May, and there are the latest numbers are in June, so we're still plugging those in, but you can see some sectors have come back very, very strong since the pandemic. Trade, transportation, utilities, which is a catch-all for everything from Amazon warehouses to NV Energy to certain trade, like retail trade, for example, so shopping gets fitted under that. These are all US Census categories, if you want to know why I'm constructing it as such. You can see they've been very strong. You can see, and I think we can do a little annotation here. So I'm gonna do a little annotation because this is fun. Anyway, so trade, transportation, utility, information, financial services, business, professional services, they've all come back really strong. But what is concerning too, and talking a little about workforce, is we can see education, health, leisure, hospitality, other services are still down. This is compared to their pre-pandemic, basically peaks. Looking from basically where we were at the bottom in April through now, and we're being at 100% means you're at your pre-pandemic level. And you can see here that there are industries here that are still struggling. And I think this is not just a Southern Nevada trend, but nationally as well. It happens to impact us faster, quicker, and harder than the rest of the country, because a 1/4 of our workforce is dependent on leisure and hospitality. And then if you add in healthcare and education, that's another 1/10. And so a very large portion of our workforce are kind of dependent on two industries that have been heavily impacted on workforce. All right, let me stop annotating. So let me change the slide. Okay. Nope, it didn't erase my annotations. Clear. Nope. Okay. All right. So what I'm showing you here too is just, again, I'm setting the table here for just some of the data. So this is about hourly earnings compared to inflation right now, which we'll talk about inflation at the end, and I'm going to have some breaks in between so you can ask questions. I know I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. But what I want to show here just very quickly is that even though we have seen pay increases in a variety of sectors, they are not keeping up with inflation. And you can see even where leisure and hospitality has been the strongest in terms of pay increases, and this is a national perspective, it's still barely keeping up with inflation, as you can see down here. You can see right here that highlighted. So essentially it's at 0. So it's just barely keeping up with current inflation. While everything else, even business professional services, trade, transportation, utilities, where we've seen strong growth in the workforce, higher levels than it was pre-pandemic, they're still not keeping up with inflation in terms of hourly wages right now. And that's something we're very much paying attention to here at CBER. And then worker participation. So I just, yesterday was looking at these numbers. So there's about a 6 million worker gap right now between jobs available and job seekers. So people that are actively looking for a job, the way it's counted by the US Census or BLS, and then the actual jobs being advertised by private non-farm employers. And what I'm showing you here in this graph is essentially worker participation rate by demographic and by education. And everything highlighted, you can see, is below the pre-pandemic level. So overall worker participation in the country is actually about a point below where it was. And it's roughly about 3 million workers have disappeared from the workforce. Now, a lot of this, there's been a lot of research, a lot of this they believe is because of the retirement of baby boomers who were, if you look at the 20-year trend, we were already on this trend of having less workers over time, but the pandemic sped that up. And so part of what we're seeing with worker shortages is, yes, there might be still people on the sidelines, but there's also a good portion of people who have taken themselves out of the workforce. One reason, not the only reason, is because they retired. And there's a question of would those workers come back at all at any point, and there's some debate on that among labor economists. But as you can see, I think what's interesting is certainly women have been impacted, certainly in their worker participation. We can see white women and African-American women. And what was concerning last fall was that the numbers that you see, so it says negative 0.08 here for like white women and then negative 0.2. Those numbers were double what they were, actually even triple what they were last fall, and even much higher. They were at negative 2% in terms of worker participation. So the amount of workers from that demographic that are actively seeking jobs. What was interesting is once pay started going up, and then we saw also school go back in, and then of course benefits kind of run out on states. Workers, particularly these groups that maybe were dependent on childcare, started going back into the labor force. What's been interesting is you still see here a large lag for white men, and you see it here for some college and associate's degrees in terms of workforce participation in the economy. And I don't personally know exactly what that is, but I think some of it may be these baby boomer retirees who are not necessarily as diverse as the younger generation, so they may have been more part of that closer to retirement age when you look at the age demographic on that. All right, so we released this month our population forecast, and we've been doing this since 1996. And we do this because originally there were multiple forecasts put out for the county. This is just for Clark County. And you think about it, if you're trying to plan for the future, and there's 4 different people doing forecasts, UNLV, Water Authority, the county, everyone's going to have divergent views on where growth is going. And you have to think about too, in the 90s, growth in Las Vegas, we were adding 1 million people every decade. And that's tremendous amount of growth for our town. So we came together, and in 1996, you know, the previous director, Keith Schwer, and the Water Authority and RTC and Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition basically said, let's do one population forecast through UNLV that is academic, that is a planning tool, essentially, so that we can better understand where our region is going and the population. And what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side, this is a forecast from 20 years ago, from 2021 years ago, it's from 2001, done by CBER on the population here in 2022. And you'll notice this number, so 2,336,928 people. Today, the population is 2,333,000 people is the estimate. So 21 years later, we've got a pretty darn, we can see from the past that we haven't done too bad a job of forecasting for the future. Now, I don't want you to get obsessed with the word forecast. Yes, it is a forecast, but really what this is a planning tool. And this is a planning tool for the Water Authority, for the county, for RTC, but I think where we're pushing this too is for the public to think about, as we grow, what does that mean for our community? And I'm sure all of you can think of very obvious things that would come with more growth, problems and potentially some solutions too. Schools, jobs, affordable housing, and of course, water. And I know I'm going to get a question on water. And I do want to say, you know, because we've used this as a planning tool, you know, today, the Water Authority uses 26% less water overall than we did 20 years ago, and yet we've added 750,000 people. So the point of this planning tool is if we use the information today, if there's going to be more people, we can start making long-term decisions and kind of nudge ourselves in a direction that is better able to accommodate for the people that reside here as we increase, but also so that we can then have a better maybe quality of life as we enjoy maybe today than we did 20 years ago, but hopefully we can improve upon that, and because we know we can do a much better job in many of these different areas. Okay. So what's our current population forecast say for 2022? Basically, it says we're going to have 700,000 more people living in Clark County by 2040. And if you want to go out all the way to 2060, it's 1 million more people. And the reason the difference there is because you have more uncertainty the further you go out. Right now, you have about 3 in every 4 people that live in, reside in Clark County that are compared to the state. So for every 3 Nevadans out of 4, they're in Clark County. By 2040, it will be every 4 Nevadans. So 80% of the population will be in Southern Nevada compared to roughly 74, 75% today. And if you want to do the simple math on this, it simply means that like by the end of this lunch hour, we're going to have 3 more people residing in Southern Nevada. That's how quickly population is growing in Southern Nevada. And of course, this is based on the past, not necessarily, we can't like necessarily jump into the future and like actually see that, but we can look at the trends and we can look at our data. And we have, if you're interested in how accurate we are, we have a whole appendix this time in the population forecast. And you can find all this on our website at UNLV, well, CBER.unlv.edu. But anyway, this is what our population forecast for the county is showing over the next 18 years. That's an incredible amount of people moving here. And obviously it raises some questions. Again, how are we going to manage water? How are we going to manage land, affordable housing, schools, jobs, public safety, you name it. And part of that is, again, to get this out in the community so that not just our agencies are using this as a planning tool, but the public is using this as a planning tool. How do we do a better job of accommodating all these different factors? Where are these people coming from? So most of them are coming is when we say this word, it's not using this in the political sense, but migrants, when we're talking about economic migrants, so in-state migration, so people coming particularly from California. And we call these economic migrants because they're coming here because it's more affordable, essentially, compared to California. And you can see this on the bottom graph here. You can see that there's the red bars are essentially economic migrants. And then I think what's also particularly we need to talk about is the blue bar, and we're looking at the bottom graph here, are retired migrants. We're forecasting essentially that the number of people 65 plus living in Southern Nevada is going to more than double in the next 40 years. And that gives us a question of how are we going to accommodate all those people. And I want to show this is so that, yes, we're going to have a large influx of older Americans that are retiring and moving here. That being said, I want to put this in perspective. When you look at the nation is also growing older, as we saw from the 2020 census, but Nevada is still Southern Nevada is still relatively younger than the rest of the nation. We're on par with Phoenix in terms of our where we are with our 65 plus population. So we still have a younger workforce than the rest of the nation, but as time goes on, those things will converge. And the other thing is we're continuing to get more diverse as a community, right? And so what you're looking at these 2 pie charts, one is for age, one is for demographics. And the way to understand this is essentially if we add 1 million more people in the next 40 years, this is how they're broken down. So 48.2% of those 1 million people, so 480,000 or so, will be 65 plus, and about 600,000 of the million will be of Hispanic ethnicity. And so we're going to get more diverse and we're going to get older. We are in some ways leading the nation in terms of demographics. As you know, Nevada is the 3rd most diverse state in the entire country, which is, I think, a huge advantage for us because the rest of the country is figuring out how do we bring in diverse communities to the economic workforce, to the economy, grow the middle class. And a lot of that is about outreach to different communities and building more of a fair sense of the world. And I think Nevada can be a huge test ground for that because we are so diverse already, and we're going to continue to get more diverse as we grow from economic migrants, and then yes, natural births minus deaths and that natural growth rate. But this is what our forecast is showing. And again, this is on our website. You can see this. Now let's talk about employment. This is essentially of that as we grow. These are the jobs essentially that we see right now growing if nothing else changes, if there's no intervention essentially. And the majority that, and we've been kind of talking about this over and over and over at CBER, is healthcare and social assistance. So yes, we're going to have a larger population of 65 plus. So that means essentially we're going to need 3 times the amount of home health aides that we need now. But we're also going to need more, we're going to need double the amount of employees working what we call ambulatory care, so in and outpatient care. So these clinics that you can go in if you have a broken arm, you can get services, so not a hospital per se. And we're going to need double the amount of staff on these ambulatory care centers. We're also going to need about 56% more people that do research into healthcare. That's just based on what we know today. Things could change in the future in terms of if we were to say train more workers in certain industries, we could then grow things like biotech in Southern Nevada, which has been talked about. And there's now approval I saw from the governor's office on laboratory space. So testing of new treatments and new experiments, and then also, of course, testing for more clinical care as well. But healthcare is going to be a big one. By 2025, healthcare is going, so 3 years from now, healthcare is, we predict, will be the second largest industry in Southern Nevada, right behind leisure and hospitality, outpacing retail trade. And that's huge for our workforce. We're going to need essentially hundreds of thousands more workers working in this space. Right now, we're forecasting somewhere around 460,000 more workers in Southern Nevada in the next 4 decades. But a good portion of those are going to be in the healthcare industry. As you can see here, about 18.1% growth. And then, of course, there's others here. So administrative support, waste management, remediation. So these are just kind of groupings that the census has put together that we use. But underneath that, you can see that there's a lot of jobs that come with those and the type of training. Of course, accommodation and food services. So that's leisure and hospitality still continues to grow. So we're not seeing a shrinking, but we see that continue to grow. But because the pie is getting bigger, the slices start to change. But that doesn't mean that the pie, again, isn't still getting bigger, and leisure and hospitality isn't getting bigger. And then you can see transportation, warehousing, that's another big one, about 11.5%. And I think, again, we have to think about this, and I'm spurring all of you to think about this, is that could mean a bunch more Amazon warehouses, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it could also mean advanced manufacturing, or it could mean other types of warehousing and trades, such as on critical materials for clean energy. But that's up to us to kind of think about what kind of community and what kind of economy do we want as we grow. We already know these things are going to be in demand, but how you shape that pie can change over time. And to give you an example of why that's true is in 1990, 1/3 of the workforce in Southern Nevada was in leisure and hospitality. Today, it's 1/4. We forecast it'll get down to about 1/6, so 1/6, about 18%. But that doesn't mean that overall that workforce doesn't grow. It's just the slices of the pie are changing. I want to be really clear about that. And then here's some of the top occupations. So again, these are not these are the subsets, and then there's a subset of that subset. But essentially, healthcare occupations are the one here you can see. And then transportation, materials, management, business, financial operations, sales related, food preparation. I think what you should be asking yourselves is, what kind of training do these need? Some of these do require a bachelor's degree or more. Some of these don't. And I think that's really important to say is that, there are things like we're going to need PhDs for, or we're going to need bachelor's degrees for, but we're also going to need, just workforce training on certificates, say for advanced manufacturing, or things like, even some management and transportation and moving materials. They don't require a bachelor's degree, but they'll pay $40 an hour. And those are helpful in terms of resiliency for every time we have a recession. And then you can see over here in terms of thousands of jobs. So we're looking at occupation group and then top 15. And you can see like nursing, psychiatric, home health aides. Those are going to be in very much high demand. So are computer occupations, so are health diagnosing and treating practitioners. So again, think about what kind of training goes into some of these. And again, not all of them require, I do want everyone to come to UNLV and get a bachelor's degree or master's degree or PhD, but at the same time, as we build this workforce and continue to grow and have these jobs, not everyone is going to be required to have those advanced degrees. And an example of this is, say for a physician clinic, for every physician in that clinic, there are 15 direct and indirect jobs created. And 2/3 of those jobs don't require a bachelor's degree. So we can grow our healthcare economy and grow our economy in general, but it doesn't necessarily, it's that combination of, yes, you need the advanced degrees, but you still need a lot of people that just have training in certain industries. And then this is GDP. So I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but I think what's really important is essentially on the left-hand side is the amount of growth. And then on the right-hand side is over time, or the amount of levels on there. So one is gain loss in billions, and then the bottom is more about, I think, over time. But healthcare is essentially one of the largest things that are going to be driving our economy. I think I mentioned this earlier, but right now about 10% of our economy is driven by healthcare in Southern Nevada. It's going to be up to 15% in the next 4 decades, and it could happen sooner if we drive some of those investments now and think about how healthcare is going to interact. But there's other things here, recreational and other services. There's recreational goods and vehicles. So this is all about consumer spending, but essentially healthcare is going to be driving this, recreation is going to be driving this. And then you have a little bit down there on the housing and some of these other things, food and beverages. I'm going to stop there for a moment because I think I'm throwing a lot of information. Are there any questions? I think you can type them out or unmute yourself. Okay, well, I can keep going. I know we're already 30 minutes in the hour, so I'm going to move on. All right, so let's talk about workers. So we did what's called the Worker Confidence Survey. We did this last fall, and a lot of this came about because there was this question of like, hey, what's going on with our workforce? Why are they not going back to work? We have a lot of unemployed people still. Do they not want to work? And we were like, well, what's the harm in asking them? So in the way we've done this is in the past, we asked the business community every quarter, hey, what's going on in your world? How do you feel about the economy? Why don't we do this for workers? So we sent a survey working with DEETR, so our unemployment agency, and Workforce Connections, and we were trying to get a mix of workers. We were trying to get people that were looking for jobs, that had jobs, and people that didn't have a job, but were looking for jobs. And it's, I'm sharing this because I think it helps just put in perspective where our workforce was last fall. I will say completely different as of today. It's 8 months later, but I still think it's relevant. 40 questions. I'm not going to do all 40 questions because I'll be here for a couple hours. But there's some highlights. So we asked them, like, are you looking for a job? If yes, are you looking for a job to match your last occupation or a new occupation? And I thought what was interesting here is a lot of people were saying, I don't want to go back to my old job, or maybe I am thinking about my old job, but I'm also thinking about a new job. And Dr. Miller, Stephen Miller, who's our research director, and I penned an article on this talking about the great reevaluation instead of the great resignation that the news media kept saying. Because I think the way we looked at it and saw it is that I think what's happening psychologically is the pandemic has been a time where we can all reflect and think about what's important in our lives, because it's a life or death situation in some sense. At least for some of us, that might have felt like that, right? And so you see this kind of thinking in the workforce, like, hey, maybe I want to do something new. Maybe I've always want to start my own business. Maybe I want to bartend. Maybe I don't want to bartend. Maybe I want to go out and get a degree. Maybe I want to get out of insurance and go into accounting. I don't, just different reevaluate what your priorities are. Or I just want to start a family or take care of the family I have. So you see this psychology kind of picking up into some of this data here and in this survey where they're looking for either a new occupation or either, and that's maybe why they were holding out of taking a job. Because we asked them, and I think that's the next slide here, did you get a job offer? If they answered yes, then we asked, well, why did you turn down that job offer? And again, this was last fall, so a little different conditions. You can see fear of COVID-19, and this was Delta. We didn't even have Omicron and B2 plus or whatever it is now. But we had fear of COVID was still high, but you also still had inadequate pay. You had job outside my desired occupations, and then you had pursuing more education and training, which I thought were kind of interesting answers. The one that surprised me was childcare, and I'm going to talk about that one in a minute. But you can see there's other things that factored in here was other family obligations, undesirable work environment. So I think there was a lot of psychology going on with workers. And again, this was they were two different kind of groups we surveyed. Those who were unemployed but looking, and those who were employed and looking. And I asked this because I thought this was all the topic last year is when you return to work, how do you prefer to work? So you want 100% remote, you want hybrid, you want in person. Surprisingly, the majority was in person. And then of course you added hybrid, that's even more. That also might just be very much our economy in Southern Nevada, where we have a lot of jobs that require in-person work compared to if I had done this survey in Silicon Valley, maybe 90% would have answered remotely because they're all working for Google or whatever. So anyway, we thought that was interesting. We've showed this to some employers of like, I think really what workers are saying is they want flexibility. They're not necessarily saying I want one way or the other. I want flexibility in my work, and that's really important to me so that I can take care of the things I want to do, such as if you've got a family or just being able to spend time with friends, etc. So then we asked, how important are the following work policies? And I know this is a little hard to read, and I haven't figured out a way to better show this, but I think it's important, is that very important. So basically the top left here says, what were the policies that were very important to you with employment, with an employer? And rate of pay, no surprise. And this is before or right around the time pay started finally going up, as we saw last fall, to get workers to come back, I think. And that was kind of like the obvious thing that employers could do, right? It's the obvious thing, raise pay, but not all employers can raise pay. I mean, sometimes they don't have the money, they don't have capital, they're not a big giant corporation, they're a small business, mom and pop shop. So it was interesting because then there's other things here like work hour flexibility was really important. So is transparent pay scale, and then opportunities for promotion, and then health and safety policy. Anyone notice what's surprising is, anything surprising in this? Childcare came up last. And here I'm going to talk about this. So this is for the whole group, 144 individuals. But when we broke this down and we looked at, say, prime age workers, particularly if they were women or men, did they have children in the household, things we all asked, suddenly childcare was very important. And particularly if they had more than one child, and then we asked the age, if you had children, what were they, preschool, were they, elementary school, high school? If they were in those prime years where they need a lot of mom and dad attention, so basically 12 and under, and you had more than one child, childcare was the most important thing in the entire world, and especially if you're a single mom or dad. And so we kind of pointed that out, as it depends on your workforce, because then if you looked at young people, so people 25 and under, things like childcare were important, but things like rate of pay or actually transparent pay scale and opportunities for promotion were incredibly important. And if they were closer to retirement, pay was really important, because obviously you're thinking about retirement, you're thinking about your savings, while when you're younger, you're thinking about your future. At least in some respects, you're thinking about where is this job going? Where is it in pay and some of these other things. And so what we've kind of found as we broke this down into this crosstabs is it really depends on your workforce and who you're hiring, where they're at in their life. And that's really what's important if you want to retain and recruit employees, at least if you want to believe the results of this survey. And there's other surveys that have been done, not necessarily, I think, in Nevada, but around the country. And some of the data has shown to substantiate this, and other data has said other things. So this is just one survey, but we found this really fascinating, and we've been in talks to do this again this fall, as a way that maybe every year we should be checking the temperature of our workforce and not just simply our businesses, and get a better sense of how workers are doing in the community and what's important to them to help our employers, right? And to help our workers both, because it's inefficient when employees are unhappy and employers are unhappy. If you can merge those two together and they better work together, then we have a more productive workforce. At least that's how economists think of things. This is just showing that breakdown. It's again hard to read. I'm figuring out how a better way to put this, but it basically shows that like women, if we're more likely to find childcare to be very important. That prime age, 35 to 54, if they were essentially not married but they had children, it was very important. And then how many children were in the household. So you could think about it like single parents. And then again, especially as you go from not just one child, but 2, 3, 4 or more, it was suddenly incredibly important, childcare. And we found this again with different demographics and different, so again, if they were younger workers, promotion. If they're older workers, pay and health are very important. Any questions on the worker side? You guys are a quiet bunch for lunch. Okay. All right, let's talk about employers. So we do every quarter a business confidence survey, and we've been doing this since 2008. And what you're seeing here is basically an index, and it can go from 0 to 200. 200 is that every business in the entire that we survey is incredibly happy and they're going to the moon, which I don't think is realistic. But what I'm pointing out here is we just conducted this survey. We released the results in July. We do it every quarter, so it's for the previous quarter. So we will do the next survey basically in September, and those results will be reported in October. But what has been interesting is last July, when we reported in the index, we had the highest score ever. And I get we were coming out of lockdown, at least nationwide, everything was easing up. We had a vaccine, people felt good. So we hit this score of 157.3, highest ever in Southern Nevada. Today, we hit not the lowest, but one of the lowest scores ever in terms of business confidence. And these are surveying businesses, random assortment of businesses around Southern Nevada. We work with the chambers to get this out, as well as some of the government agencies that work with small business, so we can capture different groups. But you can see the dichotomy. We went from feeling really good to feeling pretty pessimistic. So we went from 157 to 68. So let's talk about that. So we think about, what do you think of the economic conditions in Nevada? So this is for the state, but we're surveying people in Southern Nevada. So in Clark County, will change in the third quarter of 2022 compared to the previous quarter. You can see this pessimism, right? 49% said somewhat worse. And then some said remain the same. And then there are some really pessimistic people out there that said 19.8%, much worse. And then no one said much better. And then only a small fraction said somewhat better. So we can see kind of pessimism. And then, what is the most important challenge that you face in your business today? Well, finding qualified employees has been the #1 challenge in this survey pretty much since last year. And then economic uncertainty has now really kicked in. It's gone up and down with the pandemic. What's interesting is like COVID is no longer even a factor, at least as of the latest survey. Could maybe pop up this fall if we see another variant or things, some of these infection rates rise again. But it's not even a factor now. It was last year, but it's really, there's inflation where we say higher operating or production costs. But really, I think it's more this pessimism is businesses seem to be making money, but they're having a hard time doing it. And, because of finding qualified employees. And then there's this, should I invest? Should I not invest? With the economic uncertainty, I don't know what's coming around the corner, which from an economic standpoint, sometimes we want people to have that uncertainty because we don't want you to have the animal spirits too much and then get overly exuberant. And then we end up in situations like 2008. But at the same time, we want you to have confidence that the future isn't going to completely collapse on you and you just pull back in spending, you pull back in investment. So we're seeing some of that pessimism, and this is also mimicked in the consumer reports. If you guys have paid attention to that, consumer sentiment has also been very low, even though the economy is growing, even though we're at 500,000 net new jobs in July, even though our employment rate continues to go down. So there's kind of like two different poles going on here. And of course, we ask about the Fed. If anyone pays attention to that, as economists, we pay attention all the time. But essentially, do we think inflation is the Fed going to tip us into a recession? I know there's some that believe that we may be in a recession. I don't know if I believe that right now, because I can't see, with unemployment being so low and continuing to add jobs, even if we have 2 quarters of net negative growth in GDP, which may be more explanation of some of the things going on in import, export, and supply chains. But that doesn't mean that in the future we won't. Anyway, you can see here that there is a large concern about not getting inflation reduced, which I think probably is mimicked with consumers, and causing a recession in the near future. So sometime in 2023. And then the second one was they may be able to reduce inflation, but they're still going to cause a recession. And if any of you want me to explain how that might happen in Fed policy and interest rates, I can dive into that more, but I don't want to spend too much time right now, as I know we're running low on time. And then, but then this is what's strange to me too, is we asked them about, and this was a new question, what is their position pre-pandemic to today? And 33.7% said it's somewhat higher. So in theory, they should be better, but they're reporting like, I'm really uncertain about the next month, the next week, the next day, the next year. And I'm nervous about what's around the bend, even though everything is telling them things aren't that bad. Yes, you have higher costs and it's hard to find employees, but you're still making money. And you can see that was somewhat higher. There are some also another portion that's somewhat lower. And if we do the breakdown on business size, I'd be curious to see if that's what the difference is between large and smaller employers or mid-sized employers. And employment levels, you see the majority are either somewhat lower or unchanged. And I think that just goes to test with the struggles of workers in the workforce. And again, some of this is just natural because a lot of people retired during the pandemic and they were going to retire someday. But we also know that there's still, a struggle for employers because the demand is so high. Again, that 6 million worker gap, I think I mentioned earlier, between job seekers and employers looking for hiring right now, a number of jobs out there. And that's national, that's 6 million, not Nevada, because that'd be more people than here in the state. Any questions on that one? Well, making my life easy. Okay. All right. Let's get to the monster, the three-headed dragon really quick and talk about inflation and where that's headed. So this is inflation as of, sorry, the graph's a little weird, but essentially this is inflation as of June. PCE inflation, which is another measure of inflation. The one that gets all the headlines and that we talk about is on the bottom there. It says July headline CPI 8.5%. There's just two ways. There's different ways to measure inflation. The Fed, the lords of interest rates, the people that set interest rates in this country, they like PCE. So as economists, we tend to stick to PCE, but it comes out later. Like, for example, we won't get July PCE numbers until the end of this month. But as you can see, the trend is still the same. It's going up. It's been going up. Have we hit peak inflation? I'm a little uncertain because, and this is my own personal view, if you ask our research team, they may have a difference of opinion. I think right now we've got some issues with the base effects because we had high inflation last year. So when you're measuring this, you're adding two big things together, and so it might look smaller. And so I'm curious to see what happens in the coming months. I will say interest rates take about 6 months to a year to have their impact per interest rate hike. And we've only just started raising interest rates in March. So in theory, we won't even start feeling those first interest rates until September, but today's August. The reason why you're feeling them today with a higher mortgage and credit card is because the market takes into account, basically forecasts those rates ahead of time. But for that to actually start trickling down to the consumer, it takes about 6 months to a year. So this is, again, going back to that tightrope or kind of the Fed policy on this. This is where they could tip us into recession, is we tighten too quickly. At the same time, it's clear to me inflation's still very hot, even though gas prices have come down, and even though I don't know if necessarily grocery prices have necessarily come down the same way. But that's not necessarily what's been driving inflation. What's been driving inflation is supply chain issues and also the fact that now businesses and consumers are having to pass on, or businesses are having to pass on those higher prices, and then consumers are paying those prices, and we're continuing to pay those prices even though it's eating into our wages. And that then sets expectations to potentially be higher. So I think where we see things is a little bit hot or cold, is that inflation will come down. Interest rate increases, the federal funds rate is very powerful over time, but it's going to have a long tail. And you can kind of see that right now on the core inflation, which minuses food and energy, because food and energy can be very volatile. That's why we measure it two different ways. But for you or for me, where I see inflation usually is in the grocery store or at the pump. But those things can be volatile. You can have high gas prices and high egg prices, but have low inflation, as we saw in 2014. So, but we see core inflation starting to come down, and that's a good sign. I think it's going to have a long tail where it could be another year before we get back to what we considered kind of ideal, which is target inflation of 2%. And I think it's good if you're a wonker paying attention to this, like me, on every report, that you look at the monthly numbers, the monthly change, and not the yearly change, because there's some mathematical issues there with the base effects going on. But that's inflation, and that's kind of, we don't directly forecast inflation. I was going to have, we have a Moody's forecast that we get from them for Southern Nevada that we're working on and want to share that. But we do forecast things like treasury bonds because they're indirect hedges for inflation. And so we watch those, and what they're telling us right now is that inflation long-term will return to normal, but in the short term, I think for the fall, it's going to continue to be it's going to take some time to come down. Leading index. So this is now, stop me if anyone wants to talk about inflation, we can do that. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, I have a question. So I heard that so the core PCE inflation, like so when I heard the I think the data you showed is like Southern Nevada, is it?
No, this is national.
National. Okay, national. Yeah, because I heard like when government try to control like core PCE to be under 4%, then everything under 4% will be like restrictive on the economy. So that means that everything's slowing down. But so I was like, but while looking at Nevada is very like unique, as you presentation talked about earlier, like, you know, a lot of like blooming opportunities and with the workforce. So like, I think I don't know, like, you know, as you said, like, I think the interest rate, the effect of interest rates are gonna show. And so I don't know if how you see like in the next like 12 months, what this economy, like in local economy looks like in Nevada.
So you're asking me, how is this going to impact like employment rates, unemployment rates, employment workers?
Right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So we do forecast that. We have numbers on unemployment as well as number of workers. Basically, like I did see right before I got on here, our worst case versus our best case scenario right now. Our worst case scenario is basically that unemployment is something like around 5% right now in Southern Nevada. It would go up maybe about a point. We see it as mild. And the reason why we see it as mild, at least what I think what the data is telling us, is that there's been such a shortage that there's so much room here as they can try, you said, as the Fed tries to control inflation and say, get it down before the end of the year below 4%, which they have to put out remarks and their expectations, and they do want it below, I think they want to get it closer to 3% by the end of the year. That has essentially a trade-off for employment, and you have to cool demand. And that's why, even though we're seeing really strong numbers in employment and consumer spending in the summer, that actually gives a headache for the Fed, because that means they potentially have to tighten more. So for Southern Nevada, where we're very dependent on leisure and hospitality, on service industry, visitors, you know, we're seeing a slowdown, but because there's it was so hard to get workers back, particularly in Southern Nevada, to get them to come back and work for a variety of reasons. Right now, the data and the modeling would say that they're not necessarily going to just dump all those employees the moment there's a downturn. Because every forecast that we're seeing and that we're also seeing is mild in terms of its short term. It's maybe 3 to 6 months of a slowdown, but also that the slowdown isn't that impactful. It's not like the pandemic. It's not like the 2008 Great Recession, because workers are in a better place. They have more savings, or sorry, consumers are in a better place. They have more savings. They have more spending power, and their balance sheets and companies' balance sheets are in a better place. And because if you know that in advance, that potentially there's a slowdown, you can hedge and better plan for that. But also because you probably still don't have as many employees as you had before. So why are you going to get rid of the workers that you already have and lay them off when you can right now hold on to them? Now that may not, we already see there are some layoffs in some of these other industries, but maybe they got too big. I think it was like Google and Facebook and some of those. And then of course, some of these companies that were really hot during the pandemic, Peloton, et cetera. But those aren't necessarily Southern Nevada specific. And so that's why I think we're seeing, if in even a worst case scenario for now, which can change, but our data is saying that it's going to be pretty mild in terms of the effects on employment in Southern Nevada.
Thank you
Does
so
that help?
much. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I'm interested. I think maybe in your future presentation, I'm actually very interested, like how, like, the facts doing with the balance sheet, like the ways they do it and how, economy reacts to it. I really love to see that kind of topic.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know that's something we would necessarily do, but we certainly read papers from the Fed or from researchers who study the Fed solely, because what they're doing with their balance sheet is a bit unprecedented with the purchasing and now releasing of the bond market. And that in itself has an effect of raising interest rates as well. But we've also seen, like, say, your 30-year mortgage rate has kind of cooled. It almost went to 6%, and now it's cooled down to 5.22%. And that's still higher than, yes, I don't know about possibly pre-pandemic, but also during the pandemic. But anyways, the impacts, I think, have been so forecasted by the market, almost like it's about time you started doing that, that the impact hasn't shot interest rates up through the roof to make it almost impossible to buy a home. For example, when my parents bought their first home, it was well over 11%, and we haven't seen that yet.
Thank you so much for this information.
Yeah. So I know we're getting low on time, so I've just got one more thing. This is our, basically, or it's not a blank screen. This is our recession predictor, and this is what we call our leading index. This is public. This is our website. We do this every month. It is based on past data, so this is the latest one. And we've been doing this for 40 years, and we're the only one that does it for Southern Nevada. There are other centers for business and economic research that do this at other institutions around the country, but we're the only ones that do it for Nevada. And specifically, we do it for Nevada and we do it for Southern Nevada. What this tells us is basically looks 6 months to a year in advance based on economic conditions and variables, and then looks at, is there a downturn coming? And what it tells us there's a downturn coming is because we have a long period of essentially this line going horizontal or downward. And you can see that, so the gray bars are recessions. And essentially every time there was a recession, it was because it was either going horizontal or going down. As you can see, it was like a spring, like it bounced way up after the pandemic. And it's been continuing to go up, but it's starting to go down. Now, not every little blip means there's a downturn. As you can see, it kind of goes up and down like a little chart or a little, I don't know quite how to describe it, but what you have to see is essentially a couple of months where it either stagnates or it starts to go down. I don't have anything to say on this in terms of making a prediction quite yet. I think we need another 2 months worth of data and see if it bounces back up or goes down. And this is looking at data in the past. So this is looking at everything through, as of this chart, through May. And obviously the economy seems to change on a dime, on a weekly basis, it almost seems like. So we need a couple more months, but I highly encourage you, if you're worried about a recession, just jump on our website. We put this up every month and keep looking at this and pay attention to it. Now, we were asked yesterday during our town hall, what are our chances of a recession? I think they're under 50%, but I do think there is a high likelihood, so 75% chance that there is a cooling this fall and early next year. And I think a lot of that is just kind of a reset on the business cycle to some degree, and we're getting out of a pandemic economics and getting back into normal economics. But I also can't tell what happens this fall. Do we have another variant that causes a lot of concern and a slowdown? I also think we need to pay attention to retail sale numbers and see how consumers' spending continues into the holiday season, because we've spent a lot of money this summer, if you look at it nationally. And that's been great for Vegas. We've got the airport hitting a record 1 month in terms of visitors. And we see hotel rooms are through the roof and pricing. But if you start to minus the inflation effects on that and those costs, the numbers seem a little bit more normal than the headline number. And what worries me is that if consumers are spending all this extra money to go on vacation, do they start to finally pull back? Because you can't even with pay increases, spend forever if your pay isn't keeping up with inflation. And if inflation doesn't fall drastically tomorrow, which it's not going to, it's going to have this long tail that takes 6 months or longer. How do consumers react to that? And do we have money to go out for the holidays as we've spent in the past? Are you going to see record profits as you've seen in the past for online shopping or for Halloween or for Christmas or Thanksgiving, whatever you celebrate? And so I think it's really important to watch those numbers because that will kind of give us a better sense of then what should we expect for next year. Any questions? So takeaways, again, so expecting 700,000 more people in the next 18 years. We talked a little about workers, recruitment, and retention. We talked about business environment, where we're at. We've got this weird dichotomy where it looks, balance sheets look good, but at the same time, sentiment is not so good. I think partly inflation, I think difficulty coming out of the pandemic and for workers and businesses. And then recession, you know, I think very high chance of economic cooling. I don't allow my team to say the R word right now, but I do think, and I think the whole discussion of we're in recession now seems a little premature. I think we should be looking more down the road of it's not a question of if, but when. And then inflation, I think that comes down in the next, we'll have a long tail end, but in the next six to 12 months. So thank you. If you're interested in anything else the center is doing, we have Brews and Economic Views, where we bring academia and experts together, and we do these every other month. We just did one on esports. And then on Wednesday, October 12th, we're doing the sports economy at UFC headquarters. That's all on our website. And then November 30th, we have the arts and entertainment economy. And then we do our big economic outlook on November 17th, which is our big more forecasting and more data if any of you are interested in that. But thank you for having me. Thank you, David. Thank you, Renee.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I know we're at the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And I think if you check the chat out real quick, you'll find some resources for you if you need anything and want some more information on CBER, as well as the events we have coming up. Well, we hope you all have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everybody.